welcome everyone in person and watching later to our webinar on Off to a Good Start, Additional Support for Learning in the Early Years. We are delighted that you are joining us. My name is Hannah and I'm an Advice and Information Officer here at Enquire. I've worked at Enquire and on our helpline for over 6 years now. Before that, I worked in education policy at the Scottish Government. Before that, I worked with adults with learning difficulties. And a while before that, I was actually a young person who needed a lot of support at school, as I spent half my school years in hospital. I'll just quickly let Sharon introduce herself now.
Hi, good evening everybody. I'm Sharon. I'm also an Advice and Information Officer with Inquire. I'm a lot newer than Hannah. I've just been working with Inquire since August of last year. My background has been quite varied, from starting off with just admin secretarial, then done recruitment, and then became a financial advisor, then a police controller for 17 years, got voluntary work doing peer support for Vocal Midlothian, and I'm also a single parent and carer for my son who has additional support needs.
Fantastic, thank you, Sharon. We're delighted to have you here in Inquire as well. So we also have our Comms and Engagement Manager, Kat, here in the background. So for those joining us live, she'll be putting up links to any of the resources we mention as we go along. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to Inquire, then I'll cover the plan for this evening, then I'll hand over to Sharon and we will get fully into additional support for learning in the early years. Right, so hopefully if you're here, that means that you have heard of us. But before we go any further, I'd just like to explain a little bit about Enquire. We are the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning and have existed since 1999. So over 23 years. We are funded by the Scottish Government to provide advice and information to children and young people, parents, carers and professionals about children's rights and the legislation and guidance relating to additional support for learning. And as this slide says, our vision is that all children in Scotland are supported, included and listened to throughout their education. We do all the above through our one-to-one helpline advice, which you can use via phone, web chat and email. We also have publications on all aspects of additional support for learning, as well as the key issues that come up for the families we speak to. This is also available on our website, and we also do raising awareness work like this outreach session and our social media. We do all this with the goal to help you as parents feel more listened to and supported, feel confident to take action, to understand you and your child's rights and responsibilities, know what steps you can take if you're concerned, and know where to find more information and help. So the plan for tonight is we're going to go over the main things to know about additional support for learning in the early years and the key issues we're asked about in this area on the helpline. Our plan is for the next 30-40 minutes to cover the key rights and duties around additional support for learning, including what steps you can take if you feel your child might need extra support, how you and your child's nursery can work together to plan your child's support, steps you can take if you're worried about that support. We'll also cover some of the frequently asked questions around lack of support, deferring entry to primary, and identifying needs. And then we'll also leave about 20 minutes spare for anyone watching live who wants to ask any questions. Also, for those of you watching live, we will be linking to an evaluation form for you to complete at the end of this session, which we will also put in our email. So it would be wonderful if you could follow up with that, because we would really appreciate your feedback. Now, before Sharon gets started, with this subject in particular, there's quite a few dates and numbers around funding, when you can start things, starting school, which can be a lot to take in, we know. So we are going to cover them through the presentation, but I'd just like to say to you not to worry. They are also covered in our fact sheets. So don't panic if it doesn't go in all at once. You can follow up with that. Now, I'm just going to pass over to Sharon.
Hi. I'm obviously going to go through some more about the entitlement for funded hours. Just to say that when we're going to go over these, Some of you might already know that children aged 3 and over, and some children are actually aged 2 who meet specific criteria are entitled to 140 funded hours of early learning and childcare hours per year. This would work out at about 30 hours per week if they're used during the school term only, or 22 hours per week if they're used throughout the year. Funded hours can start in the school term following your child's 3rd birthday. There are also occasions, however, that where the local authority may be able to provide you with more funded hours, but this will depend on your child's individual needs, and your local authority will be able to confirm what arrangements they have with regards to this. When it comes to entitlement for the under 3s, with regards to 2-year-olds being eligible to start receiving their funded hours for early learning and childcare, this would be if since their 2nd birthday, they are classed as being a looked after child, and the local authority have taken some kind of legal responsibility for their care and well-being. If they're under a kinship care order and a guardian has been appointed to them, and also if you are as a parent or carer receive certain benefits, you could also be entitled to these hours, and you can find that information on our fact sheets. Some other information about your entitled hours: if you're under 3 and your child is classed as disabled, they may also be entitled to some additional support that would focus on their learning. Again, it's like a lot of things, it's based on assessment of their needs, and that's on our identifying your child's needs fact sheet. We'll explain a little bit more about this later on, but it's just to say that that obviously is an option. When it's coming to using your hours, they can be used in different settings. For this session, we'll just say nursery, but it can also apply to other settings where children get funded hours. That includes school nursery run by the local authorities, and these are where normally they're held in mainstream primaries or another local authority property. Also a private nursery that's run by an individual or a company, and they have a contract with the local authority to provide the early learning and childcare on their behalf. They are normally referred to as a partnership nursery. And there's also a nursery class that is held in a special school that can provide specialist services to children with additional support needs. When it comes to paying for extra learning and childcare, there are some nurseries that you're actually able to provide additional funded hours by the local authority. Sometimes that's referred to as wraparound care. Normally you would be responsible for paying for these, but there are situations where you may be able to get some help with the cost to cover that. If this is the case, your child's nursery or the local authority or the childcare partnership that your little one's at will be able to tell you how to apply for it. Just a quick bit about funding in itself. It is based on your individual situation. So I've just touched lightly on it. More information obviously will be on our fact sheets. And if there was something specific around your benefit or entitlement, this can be something that you could check with a local carer centre, family information services, or also for the Citizens Advice Bureau. What I'm going to do now is I'll just quickly, briefly go over with information regarding to nursery placements. Like a lot of things, different local authorities have different rules. So some will expect your child to attend their local nursery, whereas there are some local authorities you can apply to any nursery. And you can contact your local nurseries to discuss how they actually do their individual arrangements for placements to enrol your child. And you might need to apply quite early, so it might be worth checking with them when you need to do this. Most cases, children with additional support needs will attend their local mainstream nursery, and as they will be able to fully support them. However, there are times and in certain circumstances that a specialist nursery would obviously be in the best interest of your child. You can always check with your local nursery how you would be able to apply to support for your child, and if they have additional needs. And also if you were concerned or not happy actually with the decision of what nursery the local authority have actually offered you, we would always recommend that you try and go back and work with a local authority to find a suitable place for your child. And you can contact your local authority, additional support for learning officer. There's links on our websites to talk through your concerns and see if there's an agreement that can be made to, go forward. However, just to let you know that obviously if your child does have additional support needs and you are unable to come to a joint agreement with a local authority about your child's placement, it's important that you know that you as a parent and carer, you actually have the right to put in a placing request yourself. That can be to a school nursery or a partnership nursery in your local area. That could be a school nursery or partnership nursery out with your local authority, and also a nursery or an independent granted special school in Scotland. How to make a placing request is obviously quite complicated at times. So these details are in our school placements fact sheets, but you can also contact us on the helpline at any time and we can certainly talk you through all the various options that are available to you. Now that we've obviously covered that and we know a little bit about your child's entitlement to funded hours and where you might receive them, I think the key question is about what is the right support for your child. A child can be considered to have an additional support need for a number of reasons. The law is clear that they need extra or different support compared to that of their peers for whatever reason they are considered as having an additional support needs. This could be, for an example, if your child had a learning difficulty, genetic condition, physical impairment that affects their mobility. They could be a young carer. There's been issues with bullying. They've experienced a bereavement. And it's really important to know that your child does not need a diagnosis to be considered to have an additional support need to be entitled to that support. It's based on their individual needs. A child can have an additional support need for a broad range of different reasons. So once we've understood that your child does have additional needs, it's helped to know what the law says about that. But also, just to go back, it's important to remember that there can be multiple issues that might affect your child, and that could be that there's been issues with bullying and they have a learning difficulty, for example, or that they've gone through a bereavement and they have dyslexia. All of these things should be taken into consideration. The main law that covers this area is the Additional Support for Learning Act. It says that local authorities must make adequate and efficient provision to support children and young people with additional support needs to help them the best way that they can within school and nursery. And what that means is that your local authority, that's your council's education department, usually through the schools and nurseries, has a duty to provide support that meets your child's individual needs. In a moment, I'm going to go on to explain what that support can look like, but it's key to remember your child doesn't need a diagnosis to be entitled to that support, and having additional support needs can mean many different things, and it's about the impact that it's having on your child's ability to fully benefit from their education in itself. We'll go on briefly just now to cover disability children, your rights for disabled children. It's important to note that obviously we come from a place that when your child is eligible for the funded hours, which is normally when they're 3 or over. However, if your child has a disability and is aged under the age of 3, they may be entitled to some additional support that would focus on their learning before they start receiving their funded hours. If this is the case, then your local authority themselves would be responsible for assessing your child. Again, that would be to work out what kind of support would help them. This is again all covered in our Identifying Your Child's Needs fact sheet, which will be given a copy of. It can sometimes include time that if your child needs that additional help, it would be that they could attend in a nursery setting, or it would be other kinds of helps from the likes of an educational professional, like a home visiting teacher, a speech and language therapist, or perhaps a social worker. It really will depend on the individual child and will ultimately help them, but but it should be focused around their actual learning. If you think that your child might need that support with their learning before their eligible funded hours, then there may be some consideration that your child is disabled. You can get in touch with your health visitor, local authority, to ask them if they could assess what support might be needed. One of the parts in this is, I think it's really important to know, is around about the equality law. Here I also want to explain that although additional support for learning laws only really apply when your child has been assessed for their funded hours through a partnership or a local authority nursery, if your child is disabled and is attending a private nursery that you're paying for, they are still protected by that equality law. And what that means is that the private nursery must make sure that your child is not being treated unfairly, and that they make reasonable adjustments to avoid your child being at a disadvantage as opposed to that of their non-disabled peers. And more about those duties and the definitions of disability is explained in our disability rights fact sheet. Now, I'm going to go on to another section, and that's going to be about providing the actual support. So we've obviously covered about who has the right to support, but now it's important to explain what support childs are entitled to. The law in itself does not specifically say what support should look like, as every child and their situations are different. Additional support for learning can mean a lot of different things, and the support that your child gets should be based on their individual needs. That might be social, emotional, physical, or academic needs. And this is about taking into account their whole well-being. And examples of people who will obviously help support your child: teachers, that can be nursery nurses, additional support for learning workers, educational psychologists. It can also be health professionals. That's including speech and language, occupational therapists, and also physiotherapists. The examples of types of support that we hear about on the helpline and through ours is that sometimes there could be short bursts of intensive work. There may be that they've got one-to-one support or in a group setting with a key worker or learning support assistant. They can also be working with a learning assistant on learning programs such as toe by toe, and changing the nursery environment to suit a child's needs. Kind of things that I mean about that is modifying toys or equipments that would help. Say a child has a visual impairment, maybe benefit from an extra lamp. Removing rugs that slip so that will help a child who has trouble walking or mobility issues. The list's not exhaustive. There's obviously lots of things and changes that can be made to help. Providing coping strategies is also a good one, or a quiet space to help children with their behaviour, or all that is distress behaviour because of their additional support needs, and help them just be able to give them that time to regulate themselves. They can also do adapting materials or activities to a child's needs so that they can feel included. The key thing is it's about your child's individual needs. So don't be frightened to ask questions, make suggestions if you feel that will help them, because you are the expert on your child and your views are so important. When we go cover through that, you work through what the support will look like for your child, and we go on to assessments. Nursery staff, they work with you and your child, and they should be doing that to be able to identify their needs. The local authority, usually through the nurseries and schools, they have a duty to identify what your child's needs are so they can provide that right support. This might include daily observations, as well as discussing with you what's going on at home. They might also involve other professionals to help identify your child's needs and make sure that they've got the right support strategies that could help them to fully benefit from their learning. I think it's also really important that assessments should be, for you guys to know, is that assessments shouldn't be an ongoing process. It's not just a one-off activity. Staff should be looking at your child's development and progress throughout the learning year. And they also need to take into account any information as you as parents and carers provide, so that there can be a joint understanding of what the support needs is for your child. In some cases, there are more in-depth assessments that may be done in nursery, or there could be other assessments that may involve other professionals such as educational psychologists, speech and language, or CAMS professionals. Most of the times, families in the schools work together to agree the assessment, and we would recommend starting by speaking to the nursery. If you have any concerns, you can ask them what their understanding is of your child's needs, how that matches or differs from your own views. You can see if they kind of agree for any further assessments that were maybe needed that you feel would help them in identifying your child's needs. An assessment might also help them understand more about the support for your child, but it's important to remember that while you're waiting on that assessment or diagnosis, that should not stop your child from being supported in the meantime. We mentioned it before that your child does not need a diagnosis to be entitled to support, and that's really important. You as a parent and carer also have the right to formally ask your local authority for an assessment for your child if you felt that that's what was required. And that's explained again in our fact sheet for identifying your child's needs. And that will explain how you can go ahead and request the assessment yourself. Just go on next, planning for your child's support. Planning is a key part of delivering support to your child, and something we talk about a lot on the helplines when we're there. So firstly, it can help to know that all children should have some form of personal learning plan in their education. And for children with additional support needs, this must be kept under review. When planning and what that actually looks like in practice, well, we all know they can vary through different areas, different local authorities, and sometimes even different nurseries. But there are some main principles of how this usually works that I hope will be helpful. All children should have a personal learning plan. Planning should be ongoing. Families and children have a right to have their views taken into account. It might not be a written plan. It could be something that's more informal, like notes from a meeting, a verbal agreement, or something in more detail. Important thing is support should be planned. And we often advise it's not to focus on the name of the plan, it's about what's in that plan itself. Which is an example, agreement of your child's needs, how they'll be met, the targets and goals and any review dates, and how they're going to be able to keep you up to date with how your child's getting on with the support that they've got in place. Many local authorities do use some form of staged intervention as well, where it depends on the level of the needs of intervention needed, the level of the plan will increase. In Scotland, there is only one legal plan, and that's a coordinated support plan. This can help if your child requires significant support involved with many different agencies. There are, however, specific criteria that your child does need to meet to enable them to be eligible to have one of these put in place. But if your child doesn't meet that criteria, it's really important to know that that doesn't change the right to support and have that support planned. And also as well, an important thing is about transition planning. It's important to know about all of that, which I'll explain over the next 2 slides before passing over to Hannah for a change of voice for you. So the next one it will go on and just cover is transition planning for starting nursery. So if your child is under 2 or 3 and their funded hours are coming up, the first thing you might want to think about is the move up to nursery. So it can be helpful to know that your local authority has a duty to plan for this transition. So some children with additional support needs will have already had their identified school before they start. And if your local authority is aware of additional support needs, they must plan at least 6 months before the date they're due to actually start nursery. This will usually involve collecting information about your child's needs from you, from any professionals that was working with your child, and this will allow you to obviously consider what, if any, support your child will need so in it to be in place for them starting nursery. then what happens is that at least 3 months prior to starting, your local authority must send copies of the information they've gathered with your consent to the nursery they will be attending, and any professionals working with them who will be helping with their support. Could be example of the health and health departments or social work. If this hasn't already started and you're for your particular child and you're worried about their transition, you can talk to your health visitor or local authority about what the best process will be to start that off. Now we're going on to wanted to talk about the transition to primary. As we know, the move from nursery to primary can be really significant and a really worrying time for families and children. And as Hannah's obviously said before, on this one, I'm going to go over some dates and different times, but don't worry about it, it is all on our fact sheets, but it's just going to run over it for you. The actual move to primary, firstly, it's important to know that planning normally should start 12 months in advance so that everyone can make sure that your child's going to get the right support, going to get the right placement for them, and that the support will be in place when they are due to start. You should definitely be involved, obviously, in these discussions. And if there's any questions over the best school placement for your child, for example, that mainstream may not meet their needs, this is often the time to start having those conversations. Under the law around actual transition planning, your local authority, often through nursery, should gather information and advice about your child's needs from you, again, professionals working with them, and that's about at least 12 months prior to the date that they're due to start school. They should share the information they've gathered about your child, again with your consent, to the people who are going to be supporting your child at the primary, and that's to be done no later than 6 months prior to their start date. The process is often part of your general planning and potentially maybe catch-ups that you're going to have with the nursery, but it's also to ask specific, if you're not happy or you would like it, you could ask for specific transition planning meetings, if that would maybe be useful. This might involve you, it might be the nursery initially, but you could also involve other key professionals and also maybe the proposed primary school that your wee one's going to go to. I just also wanted to talk a little bit about deferring entry to primary and how this works, as this is something that we can be asked about a lot. So when it comes to the law, if your child is aged 4 at the school commencement date, which is usually mid-August, which is set by the local authority, they do not have to start school that year. Whether or not your local authority has to fund an extra year for early learning and childcare, that then depends on when your child would turn 5. So at the moment, it would mean if your child turned 5 on between the 1st of January and the 28th, 29th of February, the local authority then must provide the early learning and childcare funding for that year. But if they were to turn 5 between the 1st of August and the 31st of December, then they legally don't have to provide the funding for that year. However, this is a framework that the law, but in practice it can be very, very different in local authorities, and they have slightly different policies on providing an additional year for that funding for children who want to defer. So it's really worth contacting them to find out about their individual policy. Part of the reason that some local authorities do have different policies is because the law around this is going to change in 2023. So after the 1st of August 2023, if your child is 4 on the school commencement date and you choose to defer their entry to school for a year, they will automatically be entitled to the additional year for funding for early learning and childcare hours. And we know that there are some local authorities who have actually chosen to do this a little bit earlier. So it's obviously worth checking with them what, again, their policies are of it. If your child is not automatically eligible for the funding due to their date of birth, or they're aged 5 at the school commencement date, There are also exceptional circumstances and situations where an additional year can be funded and that's agreed by. I'll explain a bit more of that later on in our frequently asked questions section at the end. But the main thing is to know is, as above, if you feel that your child, as I've mentioned before, is not ready to start school at that expected date, then you should discuss whether you want to defer with the nursery well in advance, just to make everybody aware. And then obviously we would come on to if your child from the age of 5. Now we also know, and it's important to be aware, if you really felt that your child was just not ready to start school and they've turned 5 by that school commencement date, and you've decided not to send them, and the local authority has not agreed to actually pay the additional funding, you must find another way to educate them. For example, home education. And there's a little bit more information on how this works and is explained in our home education fact sheet. So I really hope the information that I've shared has been helpful. I'm now going to give you a rest from hearing my dulcet tones and hand you over to Hannah to cover some more stuff.
Fantastic, thank you, Sharon. Let's see. Oh, press the right button now. I'm now in charge of both the PowerPoint and my voice, which is a worry. So yes, you'll be glad to know we've now covered the main things about the laws and rights. That's a quick whistle-stop tour, and different bits will apply to different ones of you, I know. But I'm now going to get briefly into taking all this information, how you can hopefully work together with your child's nursery to make sure this all works. So although a lot of the advice and information we offer is about the law, we also spend quite a lot of time actually talking about the ways in which families can work in partnership with nurseries or their schools, because actually often that's the most important part. So first, as Sharon's already said, often what we are talking about is reminding yourselves as parents that you're the expert on your child and you have a lot of knowledge and experience that may help the nursery, and those views and that input should be taken into account. There are also lots of things that you can do to help build those positive relationships and communication with the school to make sure your child gets the support they need. And this includes kind of at the beginning, starting with, when your child starts at nursery or school, providing information about your child's needs from your view, their likes, their dislikes, and their strengths, and asking that this information can be shared with your child's key worker. You could also, kind of to get things off on the right foot, ask the nursery what is the best way to communicate with them if you do need to contact them or you're concerned. There's also kind of a lot of hints and tips we have around attending meetings. So for example, I often talk about it really helps to prepare for meetings by jotting down the issues you want to cover in the meeting, or even emailing the nursery or school in advance with your concerns or questions. You can also ask your child what they would like to say at the meeting to the people that attend. If they're still a bit wee to come along to the actual meeting, then they can still have their views heard, and they're really important. It's also helpful to just remember that you have a right to bring a supporter along to that meeting. So whether that's your pal, a family member, your partner, or someone from an advocacy or support organisation, you have a right to have a bit of support at that meeting. It also can help to remember things like you can ask to speak first, so that you get the opportunity to have your say. We also often recommend things like trying to start with something positive, even if it's just thank you for arranging this meeting and coming along, to start that tone on the kind of positive outlook of what we're going to be able to do in this meeting to move forwards. It's also to remember, we often hear from families who can be quite frustrated that a certain person who seems key to their child's support isn't able to attend. What can be helpful if you're in that situation is to ask that if an important member of staff can't attend, that they put something in writing that can be shared at the start or before the meeting, so you've still got their input in that meeting. And also, one of the things we talk a lot about is that after meetings, you ask for minutes, or even if you can't, even if there isn't capacity to have minutes taken, can you sit down and agree the actions at the end of the meeting and sign off on what they are? Or you can always, if you get out of a meeting, actually email the nursery and say, these are what I've understood, we've agreed, and the timescales, so that you've got a wee kind of written record that you've been in touch with the school, and it kind of keeps everyone right. We have loads more tips, which I'm sure you will find in our Working Together with Your Child's School fact sheet, which my colleague will be linking for you, those of you watching live. We really are aware that it can feel like a second job for parents to chase up with nursery. But if you have concerns, that's absolutely your right to do. And working on the ways that you keep in contact with your child's nursery and work in partnership can be super valuable. However, although I've just talked about working together, which is ideally what we all want, and will hopefully avoid disagreements, things do come up, and we know that families are concerned. That's often why they're phoning us. So there are lots of steps you can take if you are concerned about your child's support. So firstly, there's quite a lot of options to consider. Firstly, what we always recommend is, if you're concerned about your child's support, ask for a meeting with the nursery. This can feel a bit simple, but if you've only been having a chat with the nursery at the end of the school day at pick-up time, or they're calling you for a conversation about a specific issue, sort of in a crisis mode, it can really help to actually have a set meeting with the actual space and time for you and the nursery to prepare to discuss those issues and talk about your concerns. Part of this we often talk about is asking the right questions. So going into that meeting, or even emailing the nursery in advance to say, can we talk about what's your understanding as a nursery of my child's needs? How does this match with my views as a parent and the other people involved? How do the nursery feel they're currently meeting your child's needs? It may be that they're providing support you're not aware of, or you're seeing behaviour that actually means maybe the support in nursery isn't working for them, and there might be more things that can be done. You can also ask them to explain exactly what support's in place and explain what the objectives of that support are. Another tool that can be used if you've kind of had those conversations but things don't feel like they're moving forward is asking for a learning plan to be put in place. So there's something concrete in writing, as Sharon mentioned, so that you all have a joint understanding and agreement of your child's needs. You can then, there is kind of steps to escalation. So normally it'd be meeting with the nursery and then putting your concerns in writing to the nursery manager, or someone further up the nursery that's as part of it's a local authority nursery attached to the school. That might be the head teacher, and then possibly arranging a meeting with them to talk about your concerns. And then there's also further options like contacting your local authority additional support for learning department, because they legally have those duties above to meet your child's needs above their sort of the ones with the key duties above the nursery. You can find all their contact details on our website, and then there is significant other further steps. We always recommend starting with the nursery, but our fact sheet on avoiding and solving problems sets out those options for if you do want to escalate things. So there's things like a formal complaint, as the slide says, mediation, where someone independent facilitates conversations, and more formal routes like what's called independent adjudication, and the Section 17 complaint, which I'll not go into here, but if you do reach that point, then you can always be contacting the helpline for further advice or support. Right, so now I'm going to cover 3 frequently asked questions we hear about on the helpline around early years. But for those of you watching live, we will still have a good amount of time if you want to ask any specific questions. So if you want to start thinking about them now or popping them in the chat, I'll try and keep an eye on that while I'm talking, and so can Sharon, so that we can see if we can answer any specific questions that come up. So I had a conversation with the helpline and myself as part of the helpline about what we hear most regularly about early years and children under 5. And one of the questions we sometimes hear from families is that their child isn't getting their full hours, as the nursery say they don't have enough staffing to cover this. This is usually tied to when your child might need significant support, or there might need to be two nursery key workers for them, and the nursery are really struggling to deliver that support. However, the kind of key thing that we speak to families about in this situation is that the important thing is to know that your child has the same right to their nursery hours as any other child. So although it's a really difficult situation for the nursery, it's really up to the nursery to work out what other options can be considered, or if different approaches can be made to make sure they're offering their child their full entitlement to hours and meeting their needs. And really, if the nursery can't find a way, they need to be speaking to the local authority that's responsible for your child, because they ultimately have the legal responsibility to offer your child their hours and adequate support to find a way forwards. If you're finding yourself in this situation where there's an issue around your child getting access to their full hours, the first thing we'd suggest is to ask for a meeting with the nursery. You might want to pop that in writing in advance of that email to set out your concerns that your child isn't getting their full hours at nursery, and ask them how they feel they're meeting your child's needs, what steps they've taken to try and resolve this. For example, have they spoken to the local authority, and ask what their kind of plan for next steps is. After you've met with the nursery and put your concerns in writing, if that doesn't move things forward, then your step above that would be to contact your local authority additional support for learning contact department, which is on our website, to make them aware of what's happening, because they're the ones with the legal duties to your child. And you can kind of say out to them, how do they feel they're meeting your child's needs? There are then, hopefully at that point, things will have moved forward, but if not, there is further steps you can take. For example, if your child's disabled, and as I said, they're not receiving the same hours as their peers, specifically because of their disability, that might be a situation that could be considered discrimination. And there's particular services that we can signpost you to who can advise on that. And it's also covered in our fact sheet. Right, I'll go. So that's one of our kind of regularly asked questions. I'm not seeing any on the live chat questions come through. So I'll just continue on for the moment. One of the other questions that we hear about is parents being told their child is too young to have their needs formally assessed. I think I even heard about this on the helpline last week. Now, firstly, I acknowledge this can be really difficult and frustrating to hear when you can see that your child is struggling, but you're being told that there's this barrier to identifying their needs or working out how to support them. It is the case that some local authorities, and particularly NHS boards, might have policies around when they usually diagnose a specific condition or when they tend to assess for something. However, as Sharon said earlier, your local authority has a duty under the Additional Support for Learning law to assess your child's needs so they can support them. So although that's a little bit different from diagnosing your child's needs, because as your child doesn't need a diagnosis to be entitled to support, because they don't need a diagnosis to be entitled to support, the whole of Additional Support for Learning law isn't tied to a diagnosis, so there's not a duty to diagnose, but they still have to assess your child's needs so that they can understand how to meet their legal duties to support your child. So in these situations, we would normally suggest as a first step that parents approach the nursery and ask the nursery to explain what's their understanding of my child's needs, how do you feel you're supporting my child, and what are the goals of the support that you're currently delivering. The reason we suggest asking these questions is that they're focusing on is the duty is to identify your child's needs and meet them. So hopefully they can explain their understanding of your child's needs and how they're meeting them, which would maybe imply that they might not need to have their needs formally assessed, But also if the nursery are saying they don't know what your child's needs are or how they will support them, then you can be asking them that question of, well, what steps are you planning to take to identify my child's needs? And hopefully within that conversation, there can be more steps taken to identify your child's needs that you can agree with the nursery. But also if that doesn't move things forward, you can also formally ask for a request, or you can formally request an assessment of your child's needs directly to the additional support for learning team at the council. And that can either be generally, can you assess what my child's additional support needs are, or specifically something like asking, can my child be assessed by an educational psychologist or a speech and language therapist? The local authority can refuse, but they would have to give reasons around why that is, and that would also begin those conversations about where your concern is about how your child's needs are being identified. Also at this point, there is also ways to escalate your concerns. So if things don't move forward, but you still feel there's not an understanding of your child's needs and that's affecting their support, you can go to the head of additional support at the nursery, or you can go to the head teacher. If it's it's a nursery within a school, you can then go to the local authority directly. There's also then mediation and the kind of further steps I've mentioned that are all covered in our additional, in our avoiding and solving problems fact sheet. Right, and I've got one final question prepared for you. So again, if anyone who's going live wants to ask any questions, then we are going to be available for a wee bit of time at the end. But this final question is one we've touched on a little, and at this time of year is something we often get quite a few questions about, which is about when a parent wants their child to stay at nursery for an extra year and what they can do in that situation. So this is normally a bit different from what kind of Sharon covered when your child automatically has entitlement to their funded hours, like when they're over 5 at the schools, not like when that. So this is more about when your child is already over 5 at the school starting date, or they don't meet that criteria of being under 4, but having a birthday at a time where the council is definitely going to provide their hours. This is the situation where your child is over 5 or they're not entitled to those hours. And what happens in this situation is firstly that there's not a specific right for your child's entry to be deferred because they have additional support needs, which I think some people can think and is a bit of a kind of misunderstanding, and that some people have, that there's sort of an automatic entitlement to an additional year if your child has additional support needs or if they have a specific diagnosis. It's also not very common anymore that children get an extra year or get deferred entry to nursery, primary school. Part of that's because there's an expectation that support should be in place for a child in any year group, and that the curriculum for excellence is delivered, and teachers should be able to be flexible with each year group for a range of different levels. So P1 should be able to meet a wide variety of children's different needs. However, in exceptional circumstances, it can be agreed that a child's needs, it can be agreed that the only way to meet a child's needs is for them to get an extra year of nursery funding. If you feel your child would benefit from an extra year of nursery education, then it's really important to focus on why it is that you feel that specifically an extra year of nursery will benefit them and their individual needs. So it's not about you felt that the primary school being offered doesn't meet your child's needs, or that what's being offered at primary school you're worried about. It has to be mainly about why nursery is the right place for that and will benefit your child in that additional year. And if you do feel that's the case specifically, that it is an extra year of nursery that would particularly meet your child's individual needs, you can initially raise this with the nursery, but it will probably involve conversations with the local authority, additional support for learning team, because there's not an explicit right. So after speaking to the nursery, if they don't agree or kind of come from the same line as you, you can then put this in writing to the local authority with your reasons about why you feel your child's needs would be best met in this way. Even if you're doing this, we'd always suggest continuing conversations with the primary school being proposed about transitions, just in case you don't get the outcome you're hoping for. You can also use the avoiding and solving problems routes we've already mentioned to raise your concerns and challenge a decision, even though there's not a specific right. Those are still all options that are available to you. Now, I've had a wee question come in from one of our live members, which I am maybe going to pop to Sharon, since I've been talking for a lot, if that's okay, Sharon. So one of the parents has asked us, can I apply for nursery hours for a disabled child under 2?
Yeah, you can apply for them, but what it would be is that you would need to contact your local authority directly to see what their policy on that for going through it. So that's what you could do. You could speak to them or speak to the specific nursery. Obviously, there's certain criteria of what will come into that. So they would normally have their policies and how it's set out, and then you can take it forward with potentially the nursery that you want to go to, unless I've got that wrong, Hannah.
So it will depend on the local authority a little in that situation, because basically the duty around for disabled children under the age of 2 or that aren't eligible for those nursery hours is to offer them support to get ready for education and education focus. What the law doesn't say, it doesn't say exactly what that is. So it doesn't say a child who's disabled is entitled to nursery hours. It might be a variety of different things that could be offered. So one option is they might assess your child and say, yes, they should get some additional nursery hours. That's an option, but it also might be, yes, they should be offered educational psychologist, speech and language therapy input. So the key thing would probably be to go to your health visitor or the additional support for learning department to have a conversation about what that could be. And it could be a nursery hours, but it also might not be. So I know it can be a wee bit frustrating because it's not very specific, but it's really worth having that conversation with them and setting out your concerns about what your child specifically needs. I've now got another wee question come in. I think we've got a few minutes left. So I will just read this out as I go, or just give me a moment. So this is a parent who is transitioning their son from their 2-year-old son from a private partnership nursery to a school nursery when they turn 3. So this parent's asking, do we have any advice on this transition? So that's the transition between the private partnership nursery and the school nursery. So they've asked, do they communicate directly? So the private nursery and the school nursery, and is there a good timescale to begin this transition, for example, 6 months before starting? Do you want to take a shot at that first, Sharon?
Yeah, sorry, just apologies, I can't see the messages coming up. So that's why I maybe got that blank look on my face. I didn't see them. So yeah. So obviously when it comes into for starting the transition, and it's really important, it could be that you ask for a specific transition meeting. And if they want to, is this for any private nursery and any nursery that they maybe ask that the local authority has got a partnership with them, or from there to go to the school? Sorry, Hannah, I just want to double check that it was from nursery to school.
No, so it's from a partnership nursery, a private nursery to a local authority nursery.
Local authority nursery.
2 and 3.
Okay, so what would be different is just if that local authority, the partnership nursery in themselves, had a contract with the local authority, because it's then the local authority that would have the responsibilities throughout from that. But if they're going forward, I think you would go to the partnership if it's by an individual or a company. And I think what would be really good is to ask them to have a transition meeting and ask what their policy, what they would normally do, putting your views across. And then if they're moving up to what I would call big nursery, I sometimes describe it as moving up to the bigger nursery, it's then about setting out all that information. If you've been agreed a placement at that nursery for the age 3, then it's about making sure that all that information that you've gathered, any professionals that are involved, as we've said before, and then there will be a liaison then with consent from you, that information can then be passed over to the local authority. I think, if I'm right in saying, Hannah, you can ask for a meeting for the partnership or the private nursery to be involved, but they don't have to be. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong.
So I suppose the key thing would be a little bit here is whether your 2-year-old, the parent in this situation, their 2-year-old's getting funded hours through kind of one of the other reasons, because in that case, it's all the same local authority situation, and really they should be working together and sharing that communication. And definitely, you know, what the law says is around starting nursery and funding hours, it's 6 months in advance at least to gather information, and 3 months in advance to share that information. So certainly the timescales around that, you know, 6 months asking for a transition planning meeting would be very reasonable, and then, or at least kind of starting those conversations. If it's going from your private hours to your nursery hours, that also kind of applies the same, those 3 and 6 months. It's just maybe can be a little bit stickier if they're a private nursery, but in most cases, you know, the key thing is that everyone should want to be sharing information to give your child that positive transition. So, you know, approaching both of them and saying what's the best route for this is actually probably the best way. And you can certainly, when you're going to the local authority nursery, you know, you can communicate with them directly. Hopefully they're communicating with each other with your permission, but there's nothing to say as a parent. You know, the key thing is you can get involved in that conversation and ask. And that parent is just saying that they have had their funded hours and it's the same local authority. So certainly they should be sharing that information already now that they're aware. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, it's just
no, that's great. It's quite I've had a few direct messages coming in. Wonderful. Okay, I realize we've got to 8:30 already for those that are watching us in person. So I really hope that session was helpful. Thank you for those of you watching on catch up and those of you watching live. We really hope this was useful. For those watching live, we're going to send out links to each of the fact sheets, the evaluation form, our parents guide, including links to our newsletter if you'd like further information. And we are of course available for further questions via the helpline through email, phone, web chat and web form. We are around for that, and if you have any kind of more detailed questions that you'd like to talk through. But I really hope that was helpful for everyone who's been watching live and those who are kind of watching on catch up. And just I'll leave it to say thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks everybody.